I was reading you've been writing about what happened during lockdown, about how dissenting voices were not heard. So give us a little bit of the background there and how in which these voices were trimmed off.
Yeah, so, I mean, it's important to look back and think about lockdown being one of the most consequential and significant decisions that a government has ever taken in our lifetimes. You know, shutting down the economy, shutting down schools, curtailing our liberties. One High Court justice called it the most restrictive regime on the life of people ever. You know, beyond wartime measures, essentially. And yet, there wasn't really much debate about it. There was a kind of unanimity from the government, from politicians, in the media, on social media. And, you know, you think there would have been some dissent about this kind of huge kind of experimental measure that we were taking. And it's interesting, last week or the week before, we found out that Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor at the time, even he had his reservations about lockdown, but they weren't being heard. He was saying that, effectively, no one was really talking about the problems to come in schools. No one was really talking about the problems building for the NHS. And, you know, even more significantly, you know, there were scientists who had reservations about what was happening, people on the SAGE committee that advises the government. But a lot of the time, when they would speak up in the meetings, this wasn't reflected in the minutes that the Prime Minister was given. So he's saying, essentially, the meetings were kind of almost edited to have criticism taken out of them.
Yeah. So what do you think the reason behind that is, then? What's the motivating force?
I think that there was a kind of a conformism that spread, you know, in society. I think that a lot of people were afraid and they felt that, you know, to sort of speak out against this would be... It was as if, you know, dissent itself was a public health problem. They weren't just clamping down on the virus, but the virus of dissent, the virus of wrongthink, so to speak. So within the government, if people challenged the lockdown, they were seen as challenging Boris Johnson's authority. In the wider public, if you challenged the lockdown, or if you're a journalist who challenged the lockdown, you were seen as challenging the science. And therefore, you know, that's a view, your view is misinformation, potentially dangerous misinformation that could lead to people being killed. And, you know, more broadly, in the kind of cultural debate, I just remember, you know, there was a real vociferous response anytime someone raised any questions. You know, if you said this could be a problem for the economy, well, then the response was you're just greedy, you care more about, you know, money than lives. If you said this is a problem for our liberties, well, you're just a selfish idiot who just wants to go to the pub. If you think that there's, you know, problems in education for children, then, well, you obviously just want children to die and you want to let the virus rip and let the bodies pile high.
Wasn't that one kill grannies? I seem to remember that was the phrase they used on that one.
I mean, yeah, Matt Hancock, you know, the health secretary at the time, literally said, "Don't kill Granny." You know,
I mean, it's good advice. Anyway.
It is a good. I would strongly advise people not to not to do that.
Glad we got that out. Yeah. So the thing that I struggle to reconcile is the two things. So the motivating factor is no one wanted to dissent, but there were people who wanted to dissent, and they were silenced. So if there were people who wanted to dissent, the motivating factor isn't that no one wanted to dissent. Do you know what I mean? It's difficult to square this particular circle.
Well, I think you know, the vast majority of people did agree with the restrictions, and that's fine. You know, I think there's obviously a good argument for why we needed a lockdown. But when you're in a crisis and when people are, you know, almost like lemmings rushing towards the cliff, you do need to hear the people who say this is a mistake. It might not have been a mistake. You know, that's the other thing. That's the great thing about free speech is that, you know, we have to be able to test ideas to find out, you know, who's right and who's wrong eventually. Not every dissenting scientist is going to be Galileo and is going to, you know, be absolutely correct just because they disagree with the groupthink. But we still need to be able to challenge that kind of groupthink in order to get, you know, the best outcome for society.
Yeah, it's OK to be wrong. I'm sure I heard a
I wonder where I got that from.
But so to that point, though, about the... So it's very easy to get back into having the same argument we were all having in 2020. And it almost feels like that's where we never improve. Let's all get back into the row of, oh, mask, no mask. But the point is, even if you were saying something which ultimately was proved right or wrong, the ability to say it is something that should have been respected. Our system has it built in. We have an opposition. We have a parliament to debate stuff. It was their job to be doing this debate. What went wrong?
Well, they just abdicated their duty. I mean, people might remember the early days of the lockdown, the first lockdown. One of the first things that happened was that Parliament was suspended. And not a single, MP spoke out against this. They declared themselves non-essential. And then, and then when, Parliament came back and the Labour Party basically agreed with the government, and then when they did disagree, it was to say that we should have, harsher, kind of more punitive measures. At the same time as well, one thing we haven't touched on yet is the kind of big tech angle, the big tech censorship. So voices were being, censored or flagged as disinformation by YouTube, Facebook, Twitter. And often the basis of that was, do they go against the World Health Organization advice? And so the view of the World Health Organization was taken to be sort of holy writ, which is odd because, earlier on in the pandemic, they'd made mistakes. They said that the human-to-human transmission of COVID was not happening, which is an absurd thing looking at it now. They're allowed to make the mistakes. It was an evolving situation. No one claimed or should have claimed to have all the answers back then. But that's kind of the point. We need to, we don't know the answers. We need to test out different ideas. That's always, how we make progress.
So the nervous thing is we're thinking, OK, we're not going to have the same crisis, but who knows what's happening? The newspapers are all doom-mongering left, right and centre.
Yeah.
So what do we learn from that crisis that we could use for future things, for when it kicks, if it kicks off,
when it kicks off. I think, there's got to be no taboos, really, when we're approaching this, the energy crisis, for instance, or the cost of living crisis. Certainly, just to give you one example, there's a lot of, it's very difficult to say that maybe some of the mistakes we've made in pursuing green energy were a bad idea. It's not as reliable as fossil fuels or nuclear and things like that. But it's very difficult to have those kinds of conversations. I'm not saying that that is going to get us out of the energy crisis by any means. But, we want to hear as many new voices and ideas as possible because, we are in a big hole and conventional, boring, plodding thinking, consensus groupthink is not going to get us out of this. We need some quite radical ideas and we need to be able to hear and debate those.
So you wrote about being a dissenting voice. I just wondered, have you received any pushback from that?
In terms of, I've received pushback at the time.
Yeah.
I think people probably surreptitiously unfriended me over it and things like that. I remember it was very difficult, but I don't want to present myself as some kind of hero. I'm not. I was just following, that's just what I felt, and I felt the need to say that. And there were many other kind of honourable people who were saying the same thing. And I know that the people on the other side were completely motivated by good, the need to save lives and things like that. So, I don't want to sort of over-moralise this, if that makes sense.
You sure? Because that seems like that'd be fun. I'm not trying to push you.
There's a part of me that there's a part of me that says, look at all these terrible mistakes. Didn't you see this coming? You were warned. We told you so. But how far does that really get us?
And everyone gets to play that. It doesn't matter what it is. You could look back and go, oh no, that was the bit when I was right. You could always re-edit history for it. So I was just thinking, if you've not received loads of hate online for writing something saying we should be allowed to talk about this, maybe we have changed. Do you get a sense that? This is a leading question because I'm presuming it's a no. But do you get a sense that social media is ready to listen to dissenting voices?
I think so. It changes with every issue, right? So I think we're making progress on lockdown, for instance. There are more and more people now saying, more and more higher up people saying we would never have another lockdown, for instance. But, when the next debate comes along, there will be the same thing. People will jump up and down and say, you can't say this, you can't say that. And then eventually we'll kind of reach a new consensus, take the trans issue. I think there's been there's more openness to discussing that than there was a year ago. People were silenced immediately, but now there's a kind of growing opposition to some of the kind of more extreme elements of that people are now open to hearing, that people are now open to debating in Parliament and talking about in newspapers. So, if you are dissenting and you have the right on your side, then carry on because things can always improve and, the right arguments can win out in the end.
And do you think politicians are better? Because you're right, I think one of the things that did happen is they all thought, let's all go home and not do the job.
Yeah.
Do you think that there would be better debate in Parliament moving forwards?
I don't have that much hope about the current crop of politicians. Okay. I think we'll get the usual kind of mudslinging, a lot of heat, not very much light. It's kind of what I expect. But maybe we need both.
During an electricity crisis, I'll take the heat. Go for it. Thank you very much, Frazer. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.